Welcome back to the Acupuncture Storytime podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Rose, and before we start today's story, we have some podcast milestones to share. Number 1, we have our first fan. Shout out to Chaim Mzelik, an acupuncture student from Australia who not only commented on all 5 of the previous podcasts through Spotify comments, but also reached out with a phone call, and now we're friends after talking, so thank you, Chaim. Second, we have our first podcast sponsor, which you'll be hearing about later. So, on to story number 6. This is the story of a 90-year-old man who somehow found our clinic, and he wanted help with 3 things. Number 1, a non-healing ulcer on his leg. Number 2, acid reflux and burning sensation in his stomach. Number 3, back pain and shoulder pain. So the story here, it's not really about the treatment. I don't even know if I'm going to get to what we did in the acupuncture because there's more to the story here, and I don't know how exactly to say it. I'm struggling with how to share it because the story is about how I developed a friendship with him and about emotions of that relationship and what it meant, and I'm not quite sure how to express it, but we're going to try. I can't say his real name, but we'll call him Rob for the sake of the story. So when Rob came, he's 90 years old, and I could tell that he was lonely. He was a widower for 10 years, having lost the love of his life, and his kids lived in different states. He was a former periodontal surgeon who loved his medical practice, but he had to give it up due to aging. So this was a person whose whole life, all of his relationships, and the cultural context of the world that he grew up in was disappearing. But he had that greatest generation, 1930s energy that nothing could stop him. For example, he told me one day that because of his leg ulcer, he couldn't pedal his stationary bicycle anymore. So he disassembled the bicycle and then reassembled it in such a way that he could pedal with his arms so he could keep his daily exercise routine. This is the kind of person he is. So as he came in, I started treating his medical issues, but I also wanted to treat his loneliness. So I made sure not to double book him on most days, and I would just sit with him and we would chat for 40 minutes while he had his needles in. And I'd ask him about his childhood, tell me stories about your wife and your medical practice and your kids. And this guy lived a very full life, really interesting stories. I'll give one example. His wife came from an abusive home, a very rough childhood, and he met her and fell in love with her, and he helped nurture her into a whole person again, and she ended up becoming a Broadway star. And the two of them palled around with the who's who of the golden age of Hollywood. And he had all of these insider stories of 1950s celebrities that he was a part of the story. And it was a whole world that was so fascinating to get a peek into. Another story, he advertised for his medical practice that he needed a secretary. He says this girl walks in with ripped jeans and blonde hair down to her waist, and the first thing she said is, "You'll never hire me. I just got out of the hospital after a failed suicide attempt." It's a crazy thing to say at a job interview. Well, Rob hired her on the spot. He told me the story. He bought her clothes suitable for work, and he said, "Show up tomorrow at 9 a.m. And he ended up helping her out in various ways. He fixed up her apartment, like the electricity and wiring and stuff. And she ended up taking care of his office for 50 or 60 years. And when he talked about her to me, there was so much love in his voice for the secretary that he had, so much care. And there were so many other stories he told about life and love and living in such a different era than the 2020s that I'm in. So it started out that I was trying to do him a kindness of sitting and listening and being his friend, but I ended up feeling like I was the one to, both of us, we gained so much 'Cause this is a person who lived such a full life as a physician. He had so much warmth and so much positive masculine energy. And that energy was crystallized as he was hitting his 90s. And I feel like through my friendship with him, he gave me a piece of that energy, that warm masculine physician energy. And he passed a spark to me, like a kind of spiritual inheritance from his own surgical practice. And that, I feel like, is the most significant part of the story. The acupuncture, we came once or twice a week for 2 years. It really, really helped him. He told me that basically every single day he has a different doctor's appointment. But none of his physicians cause as much comfort, as much relief from the suffering that he was going through as his acupuncture appointments. And that's very meaningful. But as I'm thinking about this case, there's also a philosophical component to this. I wonder if I'll be able to express this well. There are 3 diagnostic lenses that I use when I'm evaluating patients. The first lens is Western biomedicine. So even though my practice is Chinese medicine, it's really integrative medicine. Before I think about the patient's qi or their yin or their yang, I establish a Western diagnosis. Someone comes in with a nose problem. I'm thinking, is this bacterial sinusitis, or is it viral, or is it allergic rhinitis? Is there an allergy to mold or dairy or something? And it's only after I establish a Western diagnosis that I examine the patient with a lens of Chinese medicine. Does this patient have harmonious yin and yang? What is the quality of their qi and blood? And I use both of these lenses to assess the patient and develop a treatment plan. But there's a third lens that's always present, it's a lens of spirituality, which I generally don't talk about with my patients, but I do find it clinically significant, which is why I'm sharing it in this podcast. And how is that clinically significant? So a basic diagnostic framework with this mindset is like this. Human beings exist within 4 different dimensions simultaneously. You have to stick with me, especially if this is a new idea. These 4 dimensions that a person lives in, they don't overlap, but they ripple effects to each other. The first of these dimensions is physical, meaning it's bound by space and time, but the other 3 dimensions are spiritual, meaning they're not bound by space and time. And this sounds very complex, but it's actually very simple, the way we're going to explain it. So the first of these 4 dimensions that human beings exist in is the physical world, our bodies, and what we touch, and how we move through space, and what we eating and sleeping, the physical. It's very easy to relate to. The second dimension of the human experience is the world of emotions. And emotions is a whole dimension of human experience that's going on simultaneously to the experience of being in a physical body, but it's separate. The 2 ripple effects to each other. If I get, angry, I might, clench my fists or get higher blood pressure or whatever. That's in the or shout or something. That's in the first physical world. But in the second world, that's emotions. And emotions are not limited by space and time. For example, if I have a feeling of love for my wife, I can feel that if we're in the same room, and I can have access to that same emotional experience if I'm halfway across the world from her. So it's not limited by space, and it's not limited by time. For example, let's say I remember something embarrassing that happened when I was 12 years old. I still cringe because that experience of embarrassment is just as real and relevant decades later than as it was when it happened. So emotions are not bound by space and time, and they're the second dimension of the human experience. The third is the world of thought, because thought is also completely separate from emotions, and it's higher than emotions, and our thoughts are also not bound by space and time. If I read Homer's The Odyssey, I'm thinking in the same pattern as a bunch of ancient Greeks, thousands of years and many miles away. But we're keeping that same pattern of thought throughout time. Thought is its own world and own human experience. And the fourth world is the most difficult to approach or articulate. And that can be described as a world of unity, a world in which things that appear to be separate are actually one. They're actually unified. And this is not something that's easy to grasp, but sometimes we have flashes and glimmers of that kind of experience. So if we examine our own personal experience, you'll see that, oh wow, I'm living in a dimension one, a physical body, and I'm having a physical experience. Simultaneously, I'm always having an emotional experience, and I'm always having a thought experience. And above that, there's a spiritual experience in that odd sense of oneness, though we often don't feel that or have access to it. So these four worlds ripple effects to each other. For example, if a person is thinking in their mind negative thoughts, for example, my boss is such a jerk, that ripples down to the world of emotions, and a person starts to feel angry. And then that anger ripples down to the physical world, causing elevated blood pressure, flushed face, aggressive movements, a shouting quality of the voice. And likewise, it ripples up. If a person is calm, but they role play anger, and they shout and they shake their fists, it actually ripples up to the emotions, and a person starts to feel angry. And then that ripples up to the thoughts and can actually cause negative judgmental thoughts. So this is practically useful as a physician, this model, because illness exists at all four levels simultaneously. For example, if somebody comes in with a stomach ulcer, that's in the physical world, that's in dimension number one. But in the emotional world, they usually have an emotional illness that accompanies, that's part of the stomach ulcer presentation, that is called unquenchable rage or suppressed rage. Not all stomach ulcers, but it's a common pattern. And then in the world of thought, above that emotion, they usually have some sort of a limiting belief or some sort of twisted belief that they're holding on to that engenders the anger. And then the fourth world is difficult to grasp, so I usually just leave that one out. But practically in the clinical assessment of the three dimensions, physical, emotional, and thought, you can create strategies in each dimension to facilitate healing. So I can use, in the physical world, acupuncture and medications, either pharmaceutical or herbal, to physically approach and treat the condition of this ulcer. In the emotional world, we can teach a person how to navigate and work through their negative feelings to not be stuck in a loop that results in the ulcer. In the mental dimension, we can try and find, through conversation, those limiting beliefs that engender the anger and help provide a different perspective and replace those limiting thoughts with something more positive. Like, instead of, oh, life is so unfair, everybody gets, good things except for me. This is a thought pattern that some people hold on to that causes terrible emotions, that has a terrible effect on the health of the physical body. If you replace life is not fair and everything is good for others but not me with I'm so happy for the success and blessings that go to other people, oh my gosh, it has such a huge effect on a person's emotions. And that ripples down, it gets rid of so much disease to change that quality. So practically in the clinic, to assess the three levels, physical, emotional, and mental, even when someone's just coming in for a physical illness, sometimes that ends up being the key to solving their conditions, especially with difficult conditions that aren't responding to typical treatments. The ulcer example is perfect because I do see a lot of patients with ulcers that don't respond well to antibiotics. And that's because the problem exists also on an emotional and mental level. It's not just physical. And that's something really cool about acupuncture and herbal medicine, because even if we're not able to get into those emotional and mental worlds of the patients, acupuncture and herbs have effects on the emotional and mental levels. And if you know what you're doing with acupuncture and plant medicine, you can tinker with a lot of specificity. Not that I really know what I'm doing that much. It's very deep and difficult field to understand how different pressure points in the body and how different plants and the way that our body metabolizes and interacts with plants can cause those changes. It's very difficult, but I have had enough success with it to see that you can touch and you can reach those difficult to change places with these modalities. And that's something extraordinarily compelling about the modalities of Chinese medicine. So the reason I am bringing this all up with the story of Rob, this idea of the four worlds, is that this was a rare case in which healing was done on the level of Atsilas, the fourth dimension of unity. That's the name of it, Atsilas in Hebrew. So, it's difficult to talk about these things in English because English doesn't really have a specificity of language. And some of the more ancient languages, or languages with texts that deal with this kind of thing in a deeper way, really open up a person's mind and ability to perceive. And when you use the original language, there's so much more clarity of thought on this kind of subjects, but that's its own whole linguistic podcast. We're going to just move back to Rob. So with Rob, hanging out and talking with him, we reached this state where we just really bonded as people. And I got to feel like a part of him is now kind of within me because we made such a deep friendship through our talk and appreciation of each other. And now in my life, I can kind of feel this essence of him and his identity as a physician, his style that came, and I can kind of pull it up and it feels like a part of my identity now. And that's unification of two separate people. That's two separate things becoming one. That's touching in the world of Atsilas. And he came for acupuncture for his physical health problems. And he was really helped by that with his pain conditions in his leg, with his pain conditions back and shoulder, in his acid reflux and digestive health. But besides for the acupuncture, there was also a healing event on a really deep level, which was that he was at the sunset of his medical career and life. And through our dialogue, he was able to pass a torch, so to speak, to pass a spark of the wisdom and kindness and the masculine goodness that he gained in 90 years and give that to a young physician at the sunrise of his practice. And I think that helped bring a certain sense of closure to him, to his own story. And now I kind of feel in my practice that I'm carrying a piece of his legacy as a compassionate physician. I took a piece of his energy. And Rob is going to be alive and active in this world as long as I am, because he has an influence on me and an influence on my medical practice that came from vibing with him, so to speak, from connecting in that sense of oneness, if that makes sense. And that's a really meaningful story for me as a physician, as a Chinese medicine practitioner, and just as a human being. So I hope you enjoyed this story. I hope you found it meaningful. I said at the beginning I was supposed to do an ad read somewhere in here. I got a sponsor for the podcast, but I just couldn't do it. There's no place in this story to insert an ad read. So you have to look out for that in the next podcast. I hope you enjoyed this. For now, please subscribe for more stories or leave a comment on YouTube or Spotify comments. Let me know what you think. And thank you so much for joining me on Acupuncture Storytime.